John Ivins, and I'll be your host this morning. Our services reflect one or more of the Unitarian Universalist principles. Today's speaker, Tom Hibberd's talk, reflects principles number 2, number 5, and number 6. Next week's speaker will be Ann Baumgartner, whose topic is belonging. Today's announcements are the Sunday Service Committee is seeking volunteers to host our Zoom services. Please contact Jean McCauley and Pam Ricker if you wish information. Now, yesterday I contacted Holly Alexander and she replied that she had no announcements for me, but there may be announcements that have come up since. Does anybody need to make an announcement? Hearing no one, we'll move on. Okay, the chalice lighting words are by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., August 28th, 1963. That's his I Have a Dream speech about 57 years ago. Here's this segment. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note, insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds.
That's it. All right.
All right, the opening words are by our founders and various people who composed the amendments to the Constitution, starting with the First Amendment. These are the words that Martin Luther King was referring to as a promissory note. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. The powers that's the First Amendment. The 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. The 14th Amendment, Section 1, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, and property without the due process of law, nor deny to any person within the jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Okay, may I introduce Tom Hibberd. Who is more familiar to you folks than I, my being a newbie to the fellowship? Tom has been a member of the NCUU fellowship for about 6 years. Tom is a clinical psychologist who is practicing here in Citrus County. Tom earned his graduate degree at the University of Texas at Southwestern Medical Center and did his undergraduate studies in anthropology at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Hence, Tom speaks as a journalist reporting on what is going on today in Portland, a city where Tom spent his college years. Tom, what is going on in Portland?
Today is
Oh, wait a minute. Tom, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. We're going to let Sally sing, okay?
Oh, all right.
And in the meantime, would everyone mute their microphones and turn off their video? Except Sally. Sally, where are you? Where'd she go?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Gotcha.
Well, I'm not going to sing. I'll just do one short, applicable piece.
Thank you, Sally. Tom, back to you. What's going on in Portland?
I just want to make one quick comment before I start, and that is I am so proud of my congregation for getting its act together to have online services. I was browbeating everybody last March, I think it was. We got to get our act together. We got to be ready when we're shut down. And people said, "Oh, yeah, fine, but who, you know how to do that? I don't know, And somebody, maybe Don Wright, maybe some others, a lot of people actually figured that out. I know it wasn't me, but I'm proud of my church for there. Uh-oh, I just lost my picture. Okay, it's all right. Now, my presentation. Today is the 95th consecutive day of Black Lives Matter protests in Portland, Oregon. Every day or night, hundreds, sometimes many thousands of demonstrators have taken to the streets. demanding an end to brutal and oppressive police behavior and systemic racial injustice. Protests in Portland began on May 26th, the day after the deliberate and unjustified murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis policemen.
Huh.
Everything okay? Okay. On May 25th, the officer forced his knee down on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes while the victim and civilian onlookers begged him to desist. Other police officers looked on passively at what was obviously a murder. Because the entire incident was recorded on video, which went viral on the internet, there has been a massive response of millions of citizens across the country demonstrating their outrage. Floyd was under arrest when murdered, by the way, because he was only suspected of passing a counterfeit $20 bill. He may not have even known it was counterfeit. He had caused the arresting officers some inconvenience by telling him that he was claustrophobic and resisting somewhat getting into their patrol car. In Portland, the protest demonstrations grew in a couple of days from a few hundred to 10,000. 10,000 people within a couple of days. Demonstrations sprang up at numerous locations around the city. The protests were spontaneous on the part of Portland citizens, not organized or directed by any particular social action group, according to Dana Buell, Director of Social Justice at Portland's First Unitarian Church. Let me just say in passing that Portland's First Unitarian Church has between 900 and 1,000 members, and they have the luxury of being able to hire a full-time director of social justice, and she was of considerable help to me in this report. The protests have occurred in locations all over Portland, but during June and July, much of the activity was centered downtown around the Justice Center, a complex including municipal and state courts, the jail, administrative headquarters of the Portland Police Bureau. Also close by, a focus of protest was the federal courthouse. Demonstrators have expressed their protest in a wide variety of different ways. Daily video coverage from the Oregonian, Portland's mainstream newspaper, shows the great preponderance of demonstrators expressing themselves vigorously but non-violently. Marching, carrying signs, chanting, and singing were very common. Many protesters simply sat in silent vigil, or at one point they lay in the streets representing dead victims of police violence. Others played music and danced. Some chose to camp out in the downtown parks with tents and campfires. Some made watchfires in the streets. Most of the demonstrators have all along been masked for COVID-19 protection. A small proportion of protesters have been more aggressive, engaging in provocative actions, such as throwing plastic water bottles. An even smaller minority have been engaged in minor acts of vandalism, such as breaking windows with rocks or breaking off pieces of wooden makeshift barriers. The police reported on a few incidents of people seemingly aiming for serious destruction by breaking into public buildings and attempting to set fires. The more aggressive activities of the protesters, when they have occurred, tended to be late at night and have involved dozens or at most hundreds of participants, while the more peaceful daytime activities have often involved thousands. Although there are about half a dozen social justice seeking groups expressing encouragement and acknowledgement of the protests, there does not seem to have been any one central leadership. Efforts to teach nonviolence to the more unruly elements through the churches do not seem to have been particularly successful. Because of the spontaneous nature of the protests, we have to see this as something different from what we were looking at during the civil rights era. There, you had protests that were highly organized, protesters that were trained, people were taught how to protest nonviolently. This has not happened. This is more or less people doing what they think best. Much of the activity of the protests could perhaps be described as educational or consciousness raising in nature. A really typical pattern has been that of Black or Native American speakers addressing large crowds of predominantly white listeners, according to Ms. Buell. The demands of speakers and protesters have included an end to inappropriate police violence, an end to the killing by police of innocent citizens, an end to discriminatory targeting of people of color as targets of police intervention, and accountability and punishment for police officers who commit crimes of violence. Many have advocated reduced funding to the Police Bureau to be replaced through employment of non-police professionals for handling incidents which do not require police action, such as those involving mentally ill persons in crisis. Statistics show that approximately half of the 50 people killed by Portland police in the last 10 years were mentally ill. A possibly small minority of people and groups involved in the protest has advocated the actual abolition of the Police Bureau. That's defunding the police in spades, so to speak. These people compare attempts to reform the police to efforts during the days of slavery to reform or regulate the behavior of slaveholders. The behavior of Portland Police Bureau personnel, according to Dana Buell, has been remarkably more aggressive and violent than that of the protesters. While the aggressive behavior of the worst of the violent protesters has been almost entirely directed toward property, the aggression of the police has been entirely directed toward the persons of the protesters. The attitude of Police Bureau personnel at the demonstrations is dramatically displayed by their appearance, which can be seen in the Oregonian daily videos. I urge you all, by the way, to tune into that. All you have to do is enter Oregonian in your search engine, and you can see the videos that the Portland journalists are making daily. These are not the stalwart ranks of blue uniformed officers whose appearance displays their oath to protect and serve. They appear more like soldiers wearing camouflage fatigues and protective armor and toting a variety of weapons. Their attitude conveys the message of confronting an enemy and being ready for a fight. The police strategy, fairly consistently, has been to stand guard in protective ranks for a while, and then at some point, which demonstrators say is not predictable, they order the crowd to disperse. This has occurred, onlookers say, whether or not the crowd contains any provocatively aggressive elements, or only a few of them, or is entirely composed of peaceful protesters. In any case, this is followed up by measures of aggressive force directed toward anyone who remains on the scene, whether they are demonstrating nonviolently, whether they are demonstrators, nonviolent demonstrators who are exercising their right not to be shoved around, or people who simply could not get away fast enough. If violent crowd dispersal measures are not effective, after violent crowd dispersal techniques have been employed, then a riot is declared, and those who are still remaining are arrested and jailed. The aggressive measures noted above have included shoving people back, pushing them to the ground, grabbing them by the neck to push them around, attacking them with so-called non-lethal projectile weapons, such as shooting guns that shoot rubber bullets or pepper balls, throwing flashbangs in people's faces. I'm not sure what a flashbang is, but apparently it can hurt you. Hitting them with nightsticks, spraying mace in their eyes, or bombarding them with tear gas bombs. It is not generally known, but being shot with rubber bullets can cause permanent injury in about 15% of cases. And tear gas can inflict pulmonary edema and permanent eye damage. What at times has been particularly pernicious, that means nasty, and terrifying is that sometimes the crowd of demonstrators being attacked has had nowhere to flee. Complaints of police violence during the first 50 days of protests were reported to, photographed, and documented by Portland United Against Hate and the Coalition of Communities of Color. You can access this information online. A typical complaint from July 7th read, I witnessed protests at the Justice Center tonight. Horrifying to see police escalate to turn downtown into as close as I've been to a natural disaster or war. I was peaceful, but yelling and chanting. Folks were yelling, chanting, playing music. A few bottles got tossed over a fence to land on concrete hundreds of feet from the police. The police just used the tactics of military to keep trying to get people to stop protesting and go home. Then they got bored and decided to keep warning us to leave if we were peaceful, so that they could just have those scary, bad protesters to get arrested. So when none of us left, because where were those bad protesters? We couldn't see them. We were all scary, bad protesters. And they sent in riot cops with guns and armor and flashbangs and seemed to enjoy it. That's what they train for, I guess, hunting down screaming people who are trying not to knock the folks in wheelchairs over. And the police were yelling instructions about how to leave in between explosions, but if your car wasn't in that place, there really wasn't any way to leave. Another complaint from June 15th read, "The protesters are demonstrating non-violently. Yes, eventually some people shake the fence, throw water bottles, and shine bike lights or laser pointers at police officers. As happens almost every night, Portland Police Bureau declared an unlawful assembly and then moved in with crowd control munitions such as rubber bullets, pepper balls, and flashbangs. Those who linger often get chased down, sometimes shoved, and even beaten with batons." A baton, by the way, is a nightstick or a club. "A crowd of people exercising its right to nonviolent protest. That is no reason to be dispersed in the first place." Quote, "There have been many reports of physical injuries to protesters, including one individual who suffered brain damage when a rubber bullet made a hole in his face. Perhaps even more pervasive have been psychological injuries. These have included panic attacks, anxiety episodes, traumatic stress responses, and severe confusion. There have been extensive reports of police deliberately targeting journalists wearing press signs, obviously displayed on their bodies, who were forced to disperse and subject to physical attack. The journalists sued in federal court because the right of the press to report on what government officials are doing is a fundamental First Amendment right. An injunction was issued to stop, an injunction was issued protecting the journalists, but then afterwards the injunction was overturned by a Trump-appointed appellate judge. I think the case is still pending. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes to the Supreme Court. Clearly marked legal observers, this would be law students, ACLU members, and so forth, who should also have been exempted, have also been targeted by police. Also, medics treating the injured have been preferentially targeted. I would like to remark here that I am particularly proud of the Oregonian staff and other Portland journalists who have stayed on the job and gotten the story despite being subject to abuse and arrest. Over the weekend of July 4th, President Trump issued an executive order to send to Portland some 100 officers from several agencies in the Department of Homeland Security. He claimed that this was necessary to protect federal property in Portland. I've got to say, you know, people were throwing rocks and breaking some windows of the federal building. Sorry. Including the U.S. courthouse and other federal buildings. He claimed that local police had proved incompetent to control the chaos and anarchy that was occurring in Portland, implying that the democratic administration of local officials was too permissive to cope with this supposedly dangerous situation. The mayor of Portland, the governor of Oregon, and both U.S. senators protested vigorously over this intervention. The actions of the federal agents once they got to Portland were not that much different from the behavior of the Portland police in most respects, but they were seen by Portlanders as an unwarranted intrusion. This caused a massive increase in the numbers of people protesting. In one respect, however, the behavior of the federal agents was seen as even more sinister than that of local authorities. They exceeded their mandate to protect federal property and began patrolling nearby streets. They made a practice of kidnapping citizens off the streets, even those not engaging in protests, and stuffing them into a car to be taken away. What was particularly threatening was that the perpetrators, the federal agents, wore no identification, and the cars that were taking people away were unmarked. Some of the victims were people just trying to walk home. This paragraph was corrected by Dana. Several federal lawsuits were filed against the intrusion of the federal agents, including one by the Western States Center as the lead plaintiff, which was joined by 2 Oregon State representatives, a legal observer, and the First Unitarian Church of Portland. In addition to citing the oppressive behavior of the federal agents, interfering with the First Amendment right to protest, the lawsuit complained that the federal intervention violated the 10th Amendment of the Constitution by interfering with the state of Oregon's right to police itself. My favorite episode of the Portland protest story occurred as an offshoot of the federal intervention. Not long after their arrival on the local scene, the federal agents, true to the spirit of the Trump administration, had a massive concrete and steel fence built around the federal courthouse. They failed to get a permit for the fence from the local authorities. Specifically, the Portland Bureau of Transportation had not permitted the fence, and the Department of Homeland Security was ordered to take it down. This order was ignored, however, and then the Bureau of Transportation levied a fine of $500 for every 15 minutes that this illegal fence remained up. A very large bill indeed at present. The fence, after all, was blocking an officially designated bike path. This is the Portland that I have long known and loved. Over the month of August, the protests have continued daily in locations all over the city. Some violence on the part of a minority of protesters has continued, particularly at night, often with apparent intent to provoke a violent response by law enforcement. Little has changed in the behavior of the police. There have been over 100 arrests in the past week. The federal agents are still there, but they're keeping a lower profile, content mostly to protect the federal buildings from inside while leaving the streets to the Portland Police Bureau. Meanwhile, there has been an increasing presence in some protest activities of overtly racist right-wing activists, leading to conflicts between the two camps. Late reports say that this has particularly occurred over the last 3 weekends. Big confrontations between the right-wingers and the normal protesters. A lot of the right-wingers, by the way, come from out of town and are what you might call white nationalists. Unfortunately, some higher level Portland police supervisors have been found to have ties to the extremist groups. By the way, a late report on these activities of these right-wing activists is available on the internet. It's again from Dana Buell. I think she has some kind of a column or something called Speaking of Justice. And the title is, Do the Police Serve? Who do the police serve and protect? It's worth reading if you can find it. Who do the police serve and protect? It's kind of a little bit scary because the gist of it is that the police are protecting the right wingers, but not the peaceful protesters. There seems to have been a growing awareness on the part of some civic leaders that the current repressive behavior of the Portland police has had a provocative effect on the protests. And there's been some discussion of having the police stand down from trying to force peaceful protesters to disperse. However, public officials also seem to fear that if they back off too much, they will be unable to protect Portland's property, that they are public property that they are required to defend. Meanwhile, there's been some discussion on the part of the mayor, the city council, and social justice advocacy groups about addressing some of the issues which protesters have been concerned about. As far as I've been able to detect, nothing concrete has been decided. I have more information about, background information about the history of racial injustice and police violence in Portland, but I don't think I have time for that. So I think this would be an appropriate time to stop and take questions.
Okay, can you hear me, folks?
Yep.
Okay, let me read the closing words by Frederick Douglass, famous abolitionist. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Okay, let's begin with our questions. We need everybody to unmute themselves and turn on their cameras. I see some of you are already doing that. Don, we should be cutting off the recording now. Otherwise, it'll be very difficult to get it uploaded, I gather. Okay. Is the recording now off?